Good morning, everyone. It's great to see you here on a beautiful November day. I'm really happy to welcome you to the 11th annual Duke Energy Conference. Thanks to Janine and to Stuart for their leadership in putting this event together, and to Varun and to Alex, the Energy Club co-presidents, and to our sponsors that are listed and you can see around our venue today. So this is the 11th annual conference. Think back to 10 years ago and where we were, what kind of conversations in this space were happening. It was a turbulent time. I joined Duke in September of 2008, and on my first day in the office, Lehman Brothers went under, which was not a particularly auspicious way to start my Duke career, but I knew it was going to be an exciting run. So 10 years ago, I just went back and said, what was kind of going on at that point? So in January 2008, crude oil prices rose briefly above $100 a barrel. President Bush, in his State of the Union address, said that we need to build a future of energy security by pioneering a new generation of clean energy technology, noting that our security, our prosperity, and our environment all require reducing our dependence on oil. He also stated we should complete an international agreement that has the potential to reverse the growth of greenhouse gases. So some of these conversations we've moved a long way. Some we're still really in the heart of today. Carbon emissions were at about 392 parts per million in 2008 compared to about 415 now. And the cost of solar were around $7.50 per watt versus under $3 now. So it's hard to imagine that world in 2008, but there's a reason for that. It's called the law of accelerating returns. People tend to overestimate what change can occur in the short term, but they underestimate what change will happen in the long term, because we just don't have a brain that's calibrated to really understand what exponential growth in these kind of questions really looks like. So today, I'd like to take just a few minutes to reflect on this idea of energy transition or energy evolution, as the conference chairs talked about. We know that there are fundamental shifts in our society and economy, and that historically, those have often been driven by changes in energy. So as we shifted from wood to coal to oil and gas, and now maybe to renewables, that's not just a technological change, but it's a change in our economy and it's a change in our society. So the stakes of this conversation are very high. The difference in this phase of energy transition versus earlier transitions is that largely they were spontaneous, organic in the past, and to a large extent, the current energy transition is not spontaneous. It's planned. It's strategized, it's roadmapped, it's laying out a future where we're actually trying to define a destination, a set of energy characteristics of the energy system that we know is compatible with the planet, meets our needs in a reliable way, and can foster continued economic growth. And I'd like to just comment on what I see as three characteristics of the current energy transition. Those being that it's essential, that it's inevitable, and that it's really, really hard. So first, to speak to the question of that the energy transition is essential. The global public's beginning to wake up to the reality of climate change and the urgent need to transition our energy systems. And there's a growing sense of crisis that's triggered not just by the projections and models of the future, but by the very real things that are happening in our world today. A new paper released just this week was signed by 11,000 scientists, stated that despite 40 years of global climate negotiations, we've generally conducted business as usual and have largely failed to address the predicament. The climate crisis has arrived and it's accelerating faster than most scientists expected. It's more severe than anticipated, and it threatens natural ecosystems and the fate of humanity. Pretty stark language. So we are in the midst of a crisis. And increasingly, it's not just about future predicted outcomes, but real tangible impacts like what we see happening with wildfires in California and PG&E, and what the future of energy must look like in that kind of world. Second, the transition's inevitable. The imperative to respond to climate change is converging with a fundamentally different economics. of energy systems. So we see transitions everywhere at the level of cities, at the level of companies, and at the level of countries, stating very ambitious goals for decarbonizing their energy system and reaching 100% renewables, not always with a clear path of how we get there, but with a bold ambition of where we need to get. And we see this in terms of the dramatic cost of renewables. For example, wind power, offshore wind costs have dropped by half in the last 3 years and continue to drop. So radical transformations in the economics of our energy system. And we appear to be at a tipping point in some respects. So countries like India that have been very heavily invested in coal until recently growing at 8 or 9% a year. Just in 2019, we see India ratcheting back to growth of less than 2% in coal. And that's because renewables are cheaper, and the cost and the challenge of delivering coal from where it is in India to where the customers are no longer makes sense in that context. We're beginning to see shifts in finance and investment and insurance, and we'll hear more about that as the day progresses, in accommodating some of the changes in the economics of our system. I think there's cause for optimism as we look at some of these potential really catalytic moments. Finally, it's really hard. It's really difficult to make energy transitions. We know that from the past. Society is increasingly divided on the energy transition, so populist movements in the US, in the UK, in France, and elsewhere have pushed back against climate action. The disruption from climate protests, increased energy bills to pay for the renewables, loss of more jobs in the industrial heartland, all these things go to the heart of societal insecurity and I think are really important issues. So as we think about the energy transition, we need to be thinking about more than just the technology transition or the economic transition. We really need to be thinking about how to make a just transition that brings everyone along. So let's take a bifocal approach to this. Let's look at what's possible today. Let's look at what's realistic, and let's look at what's just. And I think as we converge around a vision of what's possible, I think we can begin to organize ourselves as sort of partners in making that energy transition one that works for everyone.